Why did she always move like she was afraid of being seen, even when the room was empty? The armory was nearly silent, except for the steady rhythm of metal meeting metal. Rifles clicked into racks with the same mechanical finality as doors closing on secrets. Specialist worked alone in the fluorescent hum of Fort Harrison's underground armory, her movements calm, deliberate, almost too deliberate. She carried herself like someone who needed routine more than oxygen. Each weapon returned to its place with an attention that bordered on reverence, as though she wasn't just organizing steel and polymer, but laying ghosts to rest. Captain noticed her in the way one notices a pattern in background noise, slow at first, then impossible to ignore. 6 weeks she'd been on his roster. 6 weeks of quiet competence, early arrivals, late departures, no complaints, no shortcuts. In a place where soldiers cycled in and out like weather patterns was different. Reliable, predictable, invisible. And yet, something about her made the silence heavier. From his glass-walled office, let his eyes drift down to the desk. A small rectangle of plastic lay where she had left it earlier, next to the sign-in forms. He reached for his pen but stopped, his gaze drawn back to the card. An ordinary military ID, or at least it should have been. The front showed the regulation photo, details neat and unremarkable, but the back carried something that froze the blood in his veins. Stamped in faded red ink, nearly worn by time, was a name whispered more than spoken. Crosswind. Crosswind 302. His pulse stuttered. His hands trembled so hard the coffee mug tipped, spilling a brown flood across requisition forms and maintenance logs. But he barely noticed, because Crosswind wasn't a name. It was a legend, a code whispered in the shadows of intelligence briefings and campfire rumors overseas. A sniper erased from every official record after a mission no one dared to describe. Some said she didn't exist. Others swore she was real, but only long enough to become a ghost. And now that ghost had left her ID card on his desk. The fluorescent lights hummed above, cold and indifferent, while trying to control his breathing. What was he supposed to do? Pick up the phone, call security, pretend he hadn't seen it? The regulation manuals on his shelf had clear answers: report, escalate, protect the facility. But his gut whispered something else, something dangerous. Because had been here 6 weeks, 6 weeks of steady work, respectful silence, precision beyond her pay grade. She had not caused trouble. She had not drawn suspicion. She had made herself part of the armory's rhythm, so seamless that he barely remembered assigning her. And yet, one misplaced card told him he was looking at someone who wasn't supposed to exist. Why had she come here? Why now? On the armory floor, continued her inspections, moving down the racks as though nothing in the world could break her routine. The way her hands touched each rifle was more than professional, it was intimate. A faint smile ghosted her lips when her fingertips brushed the stock of a battered M16, as though it told her a story no one else could hear. She noticed the small things no one else cared about: the wear of a grip, the residue in a barrel, the way a scope had been adjusted for a left eye, not a right. To anyone else it was data, to her it was memory. She felt watching, she always did. Not in the way men sometimes looked at women. That kind of gaze was predictable, easy to dismiss. His was different, curious, cautious. The kind of attention that searched for answers rather than distraction. That made her uneasy. People who paid attention were the ones who saw what wasn't meant to be seen. And tonight the air carried something heavier than usual. The silence pressed differently. The shadows between the racks stretched longer, as if the armory itself was holding its breath. Instincts never dulled, no matter how many routines she built around herself. Something was shifting. She could feel it. Her access card was missing. She realized it when she reached the partitioned section where the sniper rifles were locked away. Normally, the card hung clipped neatly to her belt. Tonight, it was gone. She closed her eyes briefly, replaying her movements since sign-in. Of course, she had left it on his desk when she came in. Her jaw tight, sloppy, a mistake she didn't make, not anymore. She retraced her steps, silent as water over stone. In her world, silence was survival. Every movement measured, every breath controlled. She reached the office, stepped inside, and saw staring a little too hard at nothing in particular. The coffee spill on his desk was spreading like a slow-moving tide. His posture was too stiff. His breathing too shallow. His gaze flicked across the surface of the desk, papers soaked, pen cap rolling, a drawer just slightly ajar. And her ID missing. She knew instantly he had seen it. But she gave him nothing. Her face stayed calm, her voice even. "Forgot my access card," she said, her hand extending toward the desk. "Need it for the precision section." He nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Right, there it is." His eyes didn't meet hers. His hand hesitated before sliding it across. Their fingertips brushed. For an instant she felt the tremor in his pulse, elevated, uneasy. He had seen the truth, or at least a glimpse of it. And yet he handed the card back. No accusation, no alarm, just a silent acknowledgement sealed in that brief contact. Slipped the card onto her belt and turned, but she paused at the doorway. She could feel his stare pressing into her back. Slowly, she looked over her shoulder, letting the mask slip for just a heartbeat. Their eyes met, and she let him see what she normally buried, not threat, not defiance, but something far heavier. Recognition. The knowledge that secrets were now shared, whether they wanted them to be or not. "Some things are better left buried," she said softly. Then she was gone, her boots whispering across concrete until the shadows swallowed her whole. Sat frozen. The phone was inches from his hand. He could call, he should call. But every instinct screamed at him not to. He had seen competence before. Discipline, professionalism. But this was something else. If she truly was Crosswind, then she was beyond anything he had clearance to touch. Reporting her might not just end her, it might end him. And beneath the regulations, beneath the fear, was something simpler. She hadn't done anything wrong. Not here, not now. For 6 weeks she had been nothing but a soldier, quiet, reliable, invisible. Maybe she was a ghost. Maybe she was dangerous. But maybe she was just tired. In the restricted section, picked up the sniper rifles with the same calm grace she'd shown the carbines. But her hands lingered longer. One rifle in particular stopped her. A custom build, stripped of markings, balanced perfectly in her grip. The weight sang through her bones, familiar as breath. Memories stirred, clawing their way out from the locked compartments in her mind. Pre-dawn, a rooftop. The slow inhale of a distant target unaware of her crosshairs, the stillness before thunder, and then silence, always silence after. Her heart pressed against her ribs. She pushed the memories back, forced her breathing steady. She was now supply specialist, unremarkable, forgettable. But ghosts never stayed buried. Stared at the drawer where the ID card had been, his hand still shaking. He told himself he should file a report. He told himself it was his duty. But as the words of regulations echoed in his mind, another thought intruded, her voice, quiet, almost pleading. Some things are better left buried. For the first time in his 22 years of service, Captain wasn't sure if following the rules was the right thing to do. Why hadn't he picked up the phone? Captain sat alone in the armory office long after his footsteps had faded. The desk lamp hummed over a battlefield of soaked papers, coffee stains spreading like wounds across requisition forms. His hand hovered near the receiver of the phone, fingers twitching with indecision. Duty told him one thing, instinct told him another. He had seen enough in his career to know that sometimes the truth was poison. Once spoken, it couldn't be pulled back. Reporting what he'd seen on that ID card would open doors he might never close again. And what if she wasn't who the rumors said she was? What if this was some elaborate test, or worse, a trap designed to measure his loyalty? But his gut told him it wasn't a test. The way she moved, the way she touched weapons like they weren't objects but memories, the way her eyes had met his before she disappeared into the shadows, that wasn't a rookie soldier. That wasn't a clerk shuffled into a posting by chance. That was someone who had lived 100 lives in silence and carried every one of them alone. He whispered her code name under his breath, as though speaking it too loud might summon something. Crosswind. Meanwhile walked the narrow corridors of Fort Harrison, her body steady but her mind calculating. Every mistake carried weight, and tonight she had made two, leaving the ID card on the desk, letting him see the mark. Her instincts screamed to vanish immediately. She had go-bags stashed, safe routes memorized, new identities prepared. One call, one signal, and could cease to exist before sunrise, but something in her resisted. For 6 weeks she had tasted a life she thought she'd lost forever. Normal, anonymous, unremarkable. She wanted to believe she could hold on to it just a little longer. But new now, and that meant the clock had started ticking. She returned to her quarters past 2300 hours. Her room was sparse, deliberately so, the regulation cot, a single shelf of manuals, clothes folded with exacting precision. Everything visible spoke of order, discipline, nothing unusual. But behind the vent panel was another world. The encrypted sat phone, alternate IDs, the medals she could never wear again. Her life was split between 2 rooms, the one anyone could inspect and the one only she could survive in. She sat on the edge of the cot, elbows on knees, and closed her eyes. A fragment of memory slipped through the cracks. A village in the mountains. A target too young but carrying a weapon too dangerous to ignore. Her finger steady on the trigger, her heartbeat a metronome. The order came. She followed. And the echo of that choice still lived in her bones. She opened her eyes and forced the memory back down. Tonight wasn't about the past. Tonight was about survival. Across the base, still hadn't moved from his office chair. He stared at the darkened floor of the armory, haunted by questions. If she was Crosswind, what had brought her here? Was she hiding, or had someone placed her deliberately under his command? And why had she left him with a warning instead of a threat? He thought about regulations, about his oath, but he also thought about the soldiers who had passed under his command, the ones who followed orders without question, and the ones who had been broken by those same orders. He thought about loyalty, not to manuals or protocols, but to people. And he realized that he wasn't afraid of. He was afraid of whoever wanted her erased. The next morning broke gray, the kind of sky that pressed low on the earth. Woke at 500 as always, PT, shower, breakfast in silence at a corner table. She kept the same routine, but her senses were sharpened now. Every conversation around her was scanned for her name. Every officer who walked by was a potential threat. She held her manual open but didn't read a word. She couldn't. When she arrived at the armory, was already at his desk, posture stiff, eyes shadowed by a night without sleep. Their gazes met for a second too long. Neither spoke of the card. Neither spoke of what they both knew, but the air between them was heavy with it. "Morning specialist," said finally. His voice was almost normal. "Third and fourth sections need a full overhaul today. Inventory rotation." "Understood, sir," replied, her tone flat, professional. She took the clipboard and walked away, her footsteps soft as ever. But she knew this was a test. He could have assigned her anywhere. The fact that he kept her in the isolated sections of the armory told her 2 things. He wasn't reporting her yet, and he was watching, weighing, deciding. By midday, the routine shattered. Heard it before she saw it, footsteps that didn't belong. Too measured, too heavy with authority. She froze, eyes narrowing, listening. Colonel James entered the armory like a storm dressed in uniform. Mid-50s. Silver hair cut to regulation. Eyes like glass, cold, hard, reflective. His presence bent the room's air. Soldiers straightened without being told. Was on his feet instantly. "Colonel, we weren't expecting an inspection." "This isn't an inspection," replied. His voice was flat, merciless. "It's a personnel review. I'll need to speak with each of your staff, individually." The words landed like blades. Kept her head down, continued the mechanical work of checking serial numbers, but every nerve in her body was screaming. Personnel reviews didn't come unannounced. Not from colonels. Not here. This was something else. Someone had triggered a search. Through the glass walls of the office could see sitting opposite. The colonel's questions were sharp, precise. Words drifted out in fragments. Unusual qualifications, inconsistent background, anomalies in records. Her pulse slowed, not from panic, from calculation. She had minutes, maybe less. She weighed the options in silence. Stay and face the colonel, or vanish and confirm every suspicion. Then the door opened. Stepped out, his face pale but steady. He walked straight to her section, his voice pitched low. "Specialist," he said, too casual, too quiet. "Take an early lunch break. There's a situation that requires your attention off base." It was the closest thing to a lifeline she had been offered in years. Didn't flinch, didn't betray the spike of adrenaline burning her veins. She set down her clipboard. "Understood, sir." "Take all the time you need." His eyes locked on hers. He wasn't just giving her permission, he was warning her. "Go, now." She walked away with measured calm, every step a mask, but inside the decision was already made. She was leaving behind. Again. Why did the air outside feel heavier than the corridors she just left? Walked across the base with the same measured steps she used every day, clipboard tucked under one arm, expression unreadable. To anyone watching, she looked like a soldier heading to chow early. But inside, the storm had already broken. Warning had been clear. She wasn't safe anymore. Every soldier she passed might be a set of eyes that later remembered her timing. Every vehicle rolling by might carry the people had brought with him. She didn't quicken her pace. Quickness drew attention, but her mind calculated escape routes, cover points, fallback options. Her sedan sat in the far lot, the one she always chose for its distance and anonymity. She unlocked it with a casual flick, slid behind the wheel, and started the engine. The hum steadied her heartbeat. She glanced in the mirror. Behind her, the armory still stood quiet under its fluorescent hum. In the distance, a black SUV turned onto the access road. Tinted windows, government issue. She didn't need to see inside to know what it carried. She drove out through the main gate. The guard barely glanced at her ID. Routine, nothing suspicious. She smiled faintly. Routine had always been her best camouflage. 20 miles down the highway, she pulled into a rest area and killed the engine. The silence pressed in, thicker than the armory's walls. She opened the trunk, lifted the false bottom, and pulled out the go bag. Inside, cash, IDs, a sat phone. Every identity she'd lived, every life she'd abandoned, packed neatly into one bag. She sat in the driver's seat, flipped open the encrypted phone, and let her voice slip into the past. "Switchboard, this is Crosswind. Code 7. The pause on the other end was long, heavy with recognition. Then a clipped reply. "Confirmed. Extraction at Rally Point Delta. 90 minutes. She ended the call, her hand lingering on the phone. Crosswind. She hadn't spoken that name in months. She hated how easily it fit back on her tongue, like a scar pressed too often, never fully healed. The past came rushing back with it, the frozen breath of mountain nights, the weight of a rifle balanced on a rooftop ledge, the moment between heartbeat and trigger pull where time stretched and lives ended. They had made her a ghost, efficient, precise, invisible, until one mission went wrong, and then she wasn't just invisible, she was erased. Her chest tightened. She remembered the sound of a boy's laughter echoing in the scope, a split-second decision that haunted her still. She had been ordered to fire, she had obeyed, and afterward they didn't erase the guilt, they erased her. She shook her head hard, forcing the memory back. Not now, not here. The past was poison, the present was survival. Back at Fort Harrison, sat stiffly across from Colonel. The Colonel's questions cut with surgical precision. "When was Specialist assigned here? Did you notice anything unusual about her performance, her background, her behavior?" Kept his answers clipped, professional. "Transfer 6 weeks ago, performance above average, no complaints, reliable." His eyes narrowed. "And yet, her fingerprints don't match her enlistment records. Her social security number belongs to a civilian deceased 6 years ago. Tell me, Captain, how does someone like that end up in your armory?" Forced his face blank. I wouldn't know, sir. Her file appeared normal. The colonel leaned back, his expression cold. Captain, let's not insult each other. Doesn't exist. The woman working under you is someone else. Someone I've been searching for. He paused, letting the silence sharpen. Someone you may know by another name. His throat tightened. He said nothing. Silence, he told himself, was safer than lies. His gaze was unflinching. Where is she now? Lunch break, replied, the words tasting like ash. The colonel stood. Captain, I think you and I both know she won't be returning from lunch. He turned toward the door, already motioning for his aides to mobilize. Begin the search. Sat frozen, shame burning behind his ribs. He had given her a chance. Maybe it saved her. Maybe it doomed him. On the highway, pressed the accelerator harder than she should have, but the road was empty. The extraction point was an abandoned truck stop half an hour north. She kept scanning her mirrors, her mind rehearsing contingencies. If they caught her before she reached the team, she'd vanish into the woods. Change plates, burn IDs, start over, again. But her hands trembled on the wheel, not from fear of capture, from something harder to admit. She didn't want to start over this time. She wanted to stay. The quiet soldier with her books at lunch and her weapons at night. The one who could go 6 weeks without firing a shot. Normal was addictive, and she'd had just enough of it to know she wanted more. The extraction team arrived before she saw them. 2 sedans, black, windows tinted, rolling into the truck stop with precision too sharp to be casual. 4 figures stepped out, moving like shadows trained to breathe in sync. Crosswind, the lead asked. A woman mid-30s, short hair, eyes scanning everything. Nodded once, confirmed. The woman's expression didn't soften. We need to move. Hostile assets already mobilized. Extended exposure here compromises everyone. Pulled the go bag from her trunk. She looked back once at the sedan that had been hers, that had carried fragile life. Then she shut the trunk, left it behind. The convoy rolled out, engines low, formation tight. Through the back window, caught her last glimpse of Fort Harrison in the fading horizon. She thought of, still at his desk, surrounded by coffee-stained papers and questions he'd never be able to ask aloud. He had chosen silence when regulations demanded noise. And in her world, silence was the greatest gift. But she knew what his silence would cost him. As the convoy cut north, pressed her head against the cold glass and let herself imagine for one fragile moment that Alaska might be the last stop. Remote, isolated, anonymous. Maybe there finally the ghosts would lose her trail. But in her bones she knew the truth. Ghosts never stopped hunting. How many times could a person start over before they stopped being a person at all? The convoy slid north under a heavy sky, 2 black sedans cutting through rain-slick highways like moving shadows. Sat in the back seat, the go bag at her feet, her reflection faint in the tinted glass. Her new handlers didn't speak. Professional silence filled the car. She recognized it instantly. These weren't escorts. They were custodians, people who managed problems like her. Alaska, the woman in the passenger seat finally said. Her voice was clipped, professional. You'll be transferred there within 48 hours. New identity, communications specialist, low profile. Gave no reaction. She learned long ago that silence was its own kind of armor, but inside her chest tightened. Alaska meant distance, exile, a frozen purgatory where her past couldn't find her except it always did. She closed her eyes, and the hum of the tires on wet asphalt dragged her backward in time. The mountains had been black silhouettes against a gray dawn. Thin air stung her lungs as she lay prone in the snow, her rifle steady despite the ache in her bones. Through the scope, she tracked a convoy of trucks crawling up a winding pass. Intelligence had marked the 3rd vehicle. Inside, a man whose decisions had already cost 100 lives. Her orders had been simple: end him before the convoy reached the ridge. But it wasn't the target who haunted her. It was the boy in the back of the truck, no older than 12, clutching a rifle too big for his thin frame. His head poked through the flap of canvas, and for a split second his eyes found hers. Through glass and steel and distance, their gazes met. She hadn't expected to see a child. The order still came in her earpiece, cold, unquestioning fire. Her finger pressed, her breath stilled, the rifle cracked. The man slumped forward, his blood blooming across fabric. Mission accomplished. But in her memory, the echo wasn't the target's silence. It was the boy's scream. When she exfiltrated hours later, she carried more than her rifle. She carried the sound. It never left. The memory dissolved as headlights of oncoming traffic streaked across her window, opened her eyes. Her pulse was steady, but her hands were fists in her lap. She had done her job. She had obeyed orders, but obedience didn't erase the scream. The woman glanced back. You'll need to burn everything connected to. That identity is compromised. Not at once, she already knew. She had burned lives before. Back at Fort Harrison, sat alone in his office long after Colonel departed. The Colonel's words replayed like a verdict. People with her capabilities don't get to choose retirement. Had spent his career believing in the system, believing soldiers were more than tools, but tonight that belief was cracking. Had been competent, professional, human. She hadn't endangered anyone, yet the people hunting her didn't see her humanity. They saw only an asset gone astray. And by protecting her, even for an hour, he had chosen her humanity over his own career. The sound of rain tapped against his window. He leaned forward, his hands over his face. He wondered how long it would be before they turned their questions on him. On the highway's convoy turned onto a narrow road that cut through abandoned farmland. The extraction point was ahead, a forgotten airstrip long since stripped of its signage. The sedan slowed, engines low. For a moment, let herself believe she might actually disappear cleanly this time. No close calls, no last-minute compromises, just a clean transition to whoever came next. But ghosts had long memories. The sight of the cracked runway sent her back again, not to mountains but to desert heat. Another mission, another name, another erasure waiting to happen. She had been Crosswind then, fully. The target had been a negotiator suspected of playing both sides. Her orders, neutralized before the summit. She had been in place for 30 hours without food, her scope fixed on a window across the city. When the man finally entered the frame, she almost pulled the trigger before noticing what wasn't in the intel. He wasn't alone. His daughter walked at his side, her small hand wrapped around his. Adjusted her aim by instinct, her finger tightening on the trigger. She could have ended him with a breath, but the shot would have shattered more than glass. Her comms hissed, "Take the shot." She didn't. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then someone else took the decision from her. A second shot cracked from another building. Her target dropped, his daughter screaming into the echo. Froze, her scope still on the child. She had disobeyed, and someone else had obeyed. After that, Crosswind was finished. Not officially, not in paperwork, but in whispers, in sealed files. They erased her not because she failed, but because she hesitated. Because hesitation meant she was human, and in their world humanity was disloyalty. Blinked, the present snapping back around her. Rain streaked across the windshield. The convoy pulled into the cracked airstrip, tires crunching on gravel. She had been erased before. She could be erased again, but no one could erase the screams. The handler opened her door. Time to move, aircraft in 10. Stepped out, the night air cold against her skin. She looked once at the empty horizon. The airstrip felt like a graveyard of planes, of names, of selves. She hoisted her go bag over her shoulder and walked toward the waiting aircraft, each step heavier than the last. The handler's voice cut through the dark. "You'll have a new name by sunrise, Alaska by tomorrow." Kept walking, but inside her mind whispered the truth. She was Crosswind. She wasn't any of the names they gave her. She was the silence between the shot and the scream, and silence didn't stay buried forever. Why did Alaska feel less like a posting and more like a sentence? The cargo plane's engines wound down into silence as the icy wind howled across the remote runway. Stepped down the metal ramp, boots crunching on frozen gravel. A gray dawn spread across the horizon, pale light reflecting off endless stretches of snow and jagged peaks. The cold cut into her skin immediately, but it wasn't the weather that made her shiver. It was the isolation. The handlers said nothing as they unloaded her go-bag. One handed her a folder, crisp, precise, heavy with new lies. Name Shaw. Age 29. MOS, Communications Specialist. Assignment, Fort Radar Installation, Alaska. Or now, flip through the file with practice detachment. A background designed to be boring. A life meant to dissolve into snow. You'll report directly to Commander, the handler said. Keep your head down. No deviations. The less you're noticed, the safer you'll be. Gave a curt nod. Safe. She almost laughed. Safety had been stripped from her long ago. All they were offering her now was obscurity. The drive to Fort was long, silent, and cold. The installation appeared like a scar on the white horizon, a cluster of squat concrete buildings surrounded by fencing, its radar towers stabbing upward like skeletal sentinels. Inside, warmth and fluorescent lights replaced the biting wind, but the atmosphere was no less stark. Soldiers moved through the narrow corridors with the mechanical rhythm of routine. She was introduced with little ceremony. Shaw, comms specialist, the commander announced to a room of indifferent faces. A few nods, a few muttered greetings, and then she was absorbed into the flow. Just another cog, exactly as intended. Her new quarters were even smaller than her last. A narrow bed, a metal locker, a desk, a single window that looked out over endless white nothing. Placed her bag on the cot, opened the drawer of the desk and found a manual on communication systems already waiting. Predictable, perfect cover. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the frost forming on the window pane. The silence here was deeper than the armory. Not the hum of fluorescent lights or the shuffle of boots. This was the silence of exile. And yet it carried danger of its own, because silence left room for memory. She closed her eyes and the cold brought her back to another frozen place, the mountain pass, the boy, the scream. She pressed her palms against her temples until the image blurred. She told herself this was her punishment, to live with the echoes, to bury them in snow. But somewhere in her chest, a defiance stirred. She hadn't survived this long to end as a ghost in the Arctic. Back at Fort Harrison, Colonel stood in his office, the weight of authority turning the room colder than Alaska itself. His aides had spread documents across the desk, fake records dissected, fingerprints mismatched, inconsistencies highlighted. You had her under your command for 6 weeks, said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut like a scalpel. 6 weeks, Captain. Did you notice nothing unusual? Sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. She was reliable, competent, professional. Competent, leaned closer, eyes narrowing. Do you know what looks like when it's sharpened into a weapon? She wasn't competent, she was trained. Beyond anything her file should have suggested, and you missed it. Swallowed hard. With respect, sir, she caused no problems, no breaches. She did her job. That was the breach. Slammed his palm against the desk, papers fluttering. She was hiding in plain sight, and you let her. You gave her space to vanish. His eyes flicked briefly to the drawer where her ID card had once sat. The memory of handing it back to her gnawed at him. He could have exposed her. He could have followed protocol. Instead, he chose silence. Straightened, his expression shifting from fury to calculation. Do you know who she really is? Hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second. No, sir. The colonel studied him, his gaze sharp as a blade. Crosswind, he said at last, the word heavy with legend. 300 confirmed. The most dangerous sniper this military has ever produced, officially erased after a mission went sideways, and you had her in your armory. Kept his face neutral, but inside his stomach dropped. Hearing the name aloud, confirmed, made everything real. Continued. She's an asset too valuable to lose, too dangerous to be free. People like her don't get to retire, they're property, and when property escapes, it's recovered, at any cost. Forced his voice steady, and if she doesn't want to be found. His eyes went cold. Her wants are irrelevant. The word struck harder than a blow. He thought of steady hands, her quiet competence, the flicker of humanity in her eyes when she said some things were better left buried. And now this man, this machine in a colonel's uniform, reduced her to property. Realized something then. He wasn't afraid of. He was afraid of the people hunting her. In Alaska, buried herself in routine. She learned the rhythms of the radar station quickly, the shifts, the comms logs, the hum of the equipment. She made herself useful but invisible, the same strategy she'd used at Fort Harrison. No one asked questions. No one looked twice. But at night, lying awake in her narrow bed, the silence pressed harder. She thought of his trembling hands, his choice to give back the ID instead of turning her in. He had risked his career, maybe his life, with that choice. Why? Because he had seen something in her worth protecting, something beyond Crosswind. She sat up in bed, pulling the go-bag closer. She opened the leather pouch of medals, fingers tracing the cool metal. Each one a reminder of the lives she had lived, the lives she had taken. They were supposed to prove her value. To her, they only proved the weight she carried. She whispered into the darkness, as though speaking to him across miles of frozen air. "Thank you." The radar hummed on, the snow fell, and somewhere she knew his hunt hadn't ended. It had only just begun. How far could snow hide someone before the hunters learned to track silence instead of footprints? At Fort's days blended into one another. The radar installation had no real rhythm beyond the monotony of maintenance checks, comms logs, and rotating watches. The isolation was total. Miles of tundra stretched in every direction, the horizon a gray-white blur where sky and earth were indistinguishable. She woke early, trained quietly, and slipped into her role as Shaw. She answered to her new name without hesitation, signed forms with the new signature until it felt like muscle memory. The others saw her as unremarkable, a specialist in a cold, forgotten posting, exactly what the handlers wanted. But in the quiet of night, when the wind howled against the station walls and the darkness pressed in, felt the trap tightening. Exile wasn't freedom. It was a cage without locks. She stood at her small window one evening, staring at the frost crawling across the glass. In her reflection, she barely recognized herself. Not Crosswind. Not just a shadow wearing borrowed names. Her fingers curled against the sill. How many lives could she shed before there was nothing left of the woman who first wore a uniform to serve, not to kill? Meanwhile, thousands of miles south, Colonel's hunt had turned surgical. Inside a briefing room at Fort Harrison, screens glowed with dossiers, maps, and timelines. Moved between them with predatory focus, his aides trailing like hounds. She used the identity for 6 weeks, one aide reported. Background fabricated with administrative precision. Whoever built it had high-level clearance. "Of course they did," muttered. "You don't erase Crosswind with cheap tricks. You bury her deep layer after layer." Another aide spoke. Her vehicle was abandoned at a rest stop. She was picked up by unknowns. Convoy traced north, then went dark. Slips thinned. Not unknowns, ours, black teams. Someone above me pulled her out. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the implication. This wasn't just a rogue operative running. This was a tug-of-war inside the same machine. Turned toward, seated stiffly at the far end of the table. The captain had been summoned, not invited. "You worked with her the longest," said. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. 6 weeks of observation. What did you see? Kept his tone neutral. A soldier, competent, disciplined, nothing unusual. His eyes narrowed. Nothing unusual, you expect me to believe that. He stepped closer, his presence pressing like a vice. She's a sniper with 300 confirmed, a ghost with blood on her hands, and you saw nothing. His jaw tightened. He thought of quiet grace, the way she carried rifles like they were extensions of her body, the flicker of humanity in her eyes. He thought of her warning, some things are better left buried. No, sir, he said finally. I saw a soldier doing her job. The silence stretched, studied him for a long moment, then smiled without warmth. Loyalty, admirable, dangerous but admirable. Felt the trap close. He was being watched now just as had been. In Alaska, learned quickly that quiet places had their own ways of betraying you. At the installation, small deviations became noticeable. A soldier who skipped mess once too often. A voice that didn't match the background in their file. She knew she couldn't slip forever. One afternoon, as she logged comms transmissions, she caught sight of a pattern buried in the data. A ping disguised as routine but carrying the signature of surveillance. She froze. The message wasn't for the station. It was about it. Her stomach tightened, net was spreading. That night she removed the vent panel in her quarters and retrieved the sat phone. She hesitated before dialing. Every call risked exposure, but silence could be deadlier. When the line connected, the voice on the other end was as cold as the wind outside. Switchboard. This is Crosswind, she said softly. The name felt like a scar reopening. They've found me. Signals activity near fort. A pause, then. Confirmed hold position, contingency in motion. She lowered the phone slowly, her reflection in the frosted window looking back at her with eyes too tired for another life. Hold position. Easy words from people who weren't the ones holding their breath every night, waiting for the knock on the door. Her instincts screamed to move, to disappear before the snow turned red. But where? How many more names could she burn? Backen's orbit found himself cornered again. The colonel summoned him late at night, long after most of the base slept. You hesitate, Captain said, pouring himself a drink without offering one. I see it in your face. You don't know whether she's a traitor, a victim, or something else. Let me clarify for you. She's none of those. She's an asset. Assets don't get to choose their fate. We choose for them. Swallowed the anger rising in his throat. With respect, sir, she hasn't compromised this base. She hasn't harmed anyone here. His gaze hardened. She doesn't need to harm anyone here. Her existence is harm. A ghost walking free destabilizes everything. What do you think happens when stories of Crosswind resurface? When other operatives decide they can disappear too, discipline cracks, control erodes. That is the threat. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He understood now wasn't hunting because she was dangerous to others. He was hunting her because she was dangerous to them. Dangerous to the illusion that no one could walk away from the machine. Bring her in alive if possible, said. His voice dropped lower, colder. But don't mistake me, Captain. Alive or dead, she comes back. Ghosts don't get to haunt us forever. Left the office with his chest heavy. He knew what was coming. His net was spreading north, tightening around the frozen exile where was hiding. And for the first time, asked himself a question he wasn't ready to answer. If he had the chance, would he protect her again? Why did silence feel louder when you knew someone else was listening for it? The wind clawed at the radar towers above fort, whistling through steel braces like a chorus of ghosts. Inside, the installation buzzed with the dull hum of machines and the shuffle of boots on concrete. To the others, it was another uneventful shift. Every sound carried a second meaning. She sat at her console, headphones over her ears, pretending to monitor the static-choked frequencies. But her real attention wasn't on the comms. It was on the silence between them, the faint gaps where patterns didn't belong. That's where hunters hid. And they were closer now. She could feel it. For weeks she had lived as Shaw, communications specialist, a name as gray as the snow outside. She ate alone in the mess. She trained in silence before dawn. She answered questions politely and offered nothing more. It should have been safe. It should have been enough. But predators always found the trail. That afternoon, she spotted them. Two men in uniforms that didn't quite fit, moving through the mess hall with the kind of stiffness that came from training, not routine. Their boots were regulation, but too new. Their eyes flicked too often to corners, exits, windows. She didn't look at them twice. Looking was acknowledgement, but inside, her pulse slowed into the steady rhythm she knew from years behind a rifle. Danger had entered the room. Later in her quarters, she stripped the vent panel and checked the sat phone. No new messages, no instructions, just silence. The kind that felt less like safety and more like abandonment. She lay back on her cot, staring at the ceiling, her hands folded on her chest as though she were already in a coffin. She thought of then. His trembling hands, his eyes full of questions he never asked. He had given her silence when noise would have destroyed her. She wondered if he was paying for it now. And somewhere in her chest, guilt burned hotter than the fear. At Fort Harrison was already paying. Colonel had dragged him deeper into the hunt, tethering him with questions that were really accusations. "You knew," said one evening, packing the office while rain hammered the windows. "Maybe not the name, maybe not the number, but you knew." Stood rigid, his voice low. "I knew she was a soldier doing her job." Stopped, his eyes drilling into him. "You think this is about jobs, about duty. Crosswind is leverage. Whoever controls her controls fear itself. Do you understand what 300 confirmed means in the hands of the wrong people?" Didn't answer. He thought of the ID card in his desk drawer, the red ink stamped like blood across plastic. Crosswind 302 confirmed. Not numbers, not leverage, just ghosts. Leaned closer, his voice a blade. "If you can't see the threat, then you're part of it." Held his ground, but inside, he felt the walls closing in. In Alaska, felt them too. The strangers lingered. Their questions to others were casual, but their eyes were always sharp. She noticed the commander giving them wide clearance, as though he'd been warned not to interfere. Whoever they were, they had weight. That night, unable to sleep, slipped from her quarters into the howling dark. She walked past the radar towers, their lights blinking against the frozen void, and out to the perimeter fence. Beyond it, snow stretched into nothingness. No footprints, no paths, just endless white silence. She pressed her hands to the cold wire and stared into the dark horizon. A memory surfaced, uninvited. The desert, a rooftop. Her scope fixed on a target moving through a courtyard. The shot was clear, the distance perfect, but she hadn't fired, not immediately, not when she should have. She had waited too long, and in that hesitation the mission cracked. The fallout had been classified, but she carried it still. The decision that erased her wasn't the kill. It was the moment she remembered she was human. And now, in the snow, she wondered if this was her punishment. To be hunted not for what she had done, but for what she had refused to do. She turned back toward the station, the wind cutting her face raw. Inside, her reflection in the glass door looked older, heavier. Shaw was supposed to be forgettable, but Crosswind was bleeding through the cracks. The next day, the strangers made their move. They approached her in the corridor, smiles too sharp, voices too smooth. "Specialist Shaw, isn't it? Communications." Kept her posture relaxed, her tone neutral. "Yes." One of them nodded. "We're conducting routine evaluations. Nothing to worry about. Could you come with us?" Routine, she almost laughed. Nothing about their presence was routine. Her instincts screamed to act, to run, to fight, but she forced herself still. Running now would confirm everything. "Of course," she said, her voice even. They led her toward the command offices. Each step echoed too loud in her ears. She knew where this corridor ended, a small room with glass walls. Interrogation disguised as evaluation. And she knew once she stepped inside, Shaw was finished. Halfway there, she caught her reflection in a window. Her own eyes stopped her cold. They were Crosswind's, calm, sharp, unflinching. And in that instant, she understood something. She could keep running, keep burying herself under names and snow and silence, or she could stop, not with words, with choice. She slowed her steps just slightly, enough to measure the distance. 2 men, one armed, one overconfident, 3 doors to the left, a maintenance hatch 4 paces ahead. Her pulse slowed, her breathing steadied, the world sharpened. Crosswind was awake again. Far away in his office, stared at a map with pins spreading north. The colonel's voice cut through the hum of equipment. "She's in Alaska," said. "It's only a matter of time." Clenched his fists behind his back. Time, that was all had ever wanted. Time to exist, time to breathe, time to bury the ghosts. And now, even that was being taken from her. He wondered if she knew yet, if she felt the hunters breathing down her neck. And he wondered if he had the strength to keep silent again. Why did every ending feel like a beginning she didn't want? Snow whipped across the radar station as if the Arctic itself wanted to erase footprints before they could tell a story, moved through the narrow corridors between humming machinery and fluorescent shadows, flanked by the 2 men who claimed this was routine. Their voices were casual, but their posture wasn't. Hands near belts, eyes scanning, bodies tense. They thought they were shepherding a lamb. They didn't realize they'd cornered a wolf that had once learned how to move without sound, breathe without fear, kill without hesitation. Her breathing slowed, every sense sharpened. Ahead, the maintenance hatch. Left, the fire exit leading to the yard. Behind, 2 men thinking they were in control. She smiled faintly, just enough to keep them easy. "Evaluations, huh?" she said. One chuckled. "Just procedure, won't take long." Her eyes flicked to the reflection in the window. Not Shaw, not even the erased name buried in classified files. Crosswind looked back at her, calm, calculating, ready. 3 steps from the hatch, she moved. Her elbow snapped backward, catching the first man in the throat. He gagged, collapsing against the wall. She pivoted, catching the second by the wrist before his hand reached his weapon. A twist, a crack, and his arm hung limp. She shoved him hard into the hatch door, forcing it open with the impact. The blare of the alarm split the silence. Red lights pulsed overhead. Soldiers shouted from down the corridor. Boots thundered. Slipped into the hatch, dropping into the maintenance tunnel as chaos erupted above. She ran hunched, the steel echoing with her boots, the air biting cold. She had no rifle, no scope, no sniper's nest, but she had instinct, and instinct had kept her alive longer than her file ever admitted. Outside, the wind tore at her as she burst from the tunnel into the frozen yard. Sirens wailed behind her. Floodlights snapped on, carving the snow into blinding white. Figures spilled from the station, weapons drawn, orders barked. She didn't stop, couldn't. The snow pulled at her boots, the cold burning her lungs. Each breath came out in harsh clouds. She didn't think of Alaska, didn't think of Shaw. She thought of sitting at his desk with trembling hands, choosing silence when noise would have destroyed her. She thought of the boy in the truck, the scream in the desert, the daughter in the window. She thought of every life stolen, every name burned. And she thought, not this one, not tonight. In Fort Harrison, Sadin's office, the map of Alaska glowing on the wall. A red circle pulsed over Fort. "They have her," said. His voice was tight with satisfaction. "Containment's already in motion." Stared at the map. He saw snow. He saw silence. He saw her running the way she had walked through the armory, quiet, precise, determined. He wanted to ask what would happen if they caught her, alive or dead, but he already knew the answer. His silence was his only rebellion. In Alaska, the chase cut through the night. Crested a ridge, her breath ragged, her vision sharp. Below, black SUVs tore across the snow, their headlights cutting through the storm. She dropped to one knee, scanning instinctively for cover. A cluster of boulders jutted from the ridge like broken teeth. She slid behind them, pressed her back against the ice, and closed her eyes for half a second. Her hands shook not from fear but from the cold truth. She was tired, tired of running, tired of burying names, tired of being a weapon no one allowed to rest. Boots crunched in the snow below, voices barked orders, floodlights swept the ridge. Her body moved without thought. She hurled a fistful of snow and rock toward the lights, buying seconds. As they swung toward the decoy, she slipped around the far side of the ridge, her steps vanishing into the storm. Minutes stretched into hours. By the time the floodlights dimmed and the SUVs pulled back toward the station, she was gone, swallowed by the white. Colonel's voice carried through the comms, sharp with fury. "She's on foot. Track her. Don't stop until you have her." But the snow didn't care for orders. It erased every trail. By dawn, the search grid was wide. The storm heavier and Crosswind had vanished. At Fort Harrison sat at his desk, staring at the same coffee-stained requisition forms he'd abandoned weeks earlier. His career was likely finished. Would see to that. But as he closed the drawer where his ID had once been hidden, he felt no regret. Because silence had been his choice, and sometimes silence was the only way to protect dignity. Walked alone across the tundra, her body aching, her mind clear. Each step carried her farther from Shaw, farther even from Crosswind. She didn't know what name she would wear next, what life she would borrow, but she knew this: she had outlasted them again. The horizon stretched endless, white and unforgiving, but for the first time in weeks she felt a strange peace. Not safety, not freedom, just the fragile knowledge that she still had choices. And sometimes choices were enough. She paused, looking back once at the fatting towers of the radar station. In the distance, she thought of the man who had chosen silence when he could have destroyed her. A soldier who understood that rules didn't always protect people, but people could protect each other. She turned into the wind, her breath vanishing into the endless white. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.